Alice van Duren, a 38-year-old woman from Belgium, was married to a jewelry craftsman named Jan de Wilde. They had 2 children, Vincent de Wilde and Carol de Wilde. Although she worked in the family's jewelry store, Van Doren's real passion was skydiving. She started skydiving with her husband in 1994, and her enthusiasm for the sport grew over time. With 2,300 jumps to her name, she became an experienced skydiver. Every weekend and on holidays, she dedicated her time to skydiving. In 1998, Van Doren started formation jumping and joined an all-female skydiving team, the Divas, in 2001. They even competed in the World Skydiving Championships in 2003. Unfortunately, Van Doren had to leave the group in 2004 because of health problems related to a hernia. After she got better, she decided to skydive for fun. Instead of competition, she became a member of the Swartberg Parachute Club, and by 2006 she had completed over 2,300 successful jumps. It was in this club where she became close friends with another skydiver, a 26-year-old school teacher named Van Doren Klottermans. Because they both had the same first name, Van Doren later came up with the nickname Babs for her younger friend to avoid any confusion. Another member of the club, a man named Marcel Summers, was also friends with both women. The 3 of them became good friends and started diving together during their skydiving tricks. Over time, Van Doren grew closer to Marcel, despite being married. Their friendship turned into a romantic involvement. Van Doren's family was accustomed to her spending weekends at the skydiving club, which unknowingly helped her conceal her relationship with Marcel from her husband. They would often visit Marcel's apartment, spending their weekends together without any worry. Van Doren was unaware that she and Klotmans not only shared a first name, but also the same man. Without either woman knowing, Marcel had been secretly involved with both of them intimately to juggle both relationships. He created a schedule assigning specific days for each woman. Fridays were for Klottermans, while Saturdays were for Van Doren. This setup worked well for Marcel for a while, but it wouldn't last long as an unexpected turn of events was on the horizon. On a particular weekend, on the evening of Friday, November 10, 2006, Klottermans went to Marcel's place as they usually did every week. Little did she know, Els Van Doren had decided to surprise Marcel by showing up unexpectedly that same night. Klotmans and Marcel were having dinner together when they returned to Marcel's apartment and found Van Doren waiting outside his door. The details of their subsequent conversation are unknown, but what is certain is that on that night Klotmans did not share Marcel's bed. Instead, she ended up sleeping in a sleeping bag on the living room floor while Van Doren and Marcel went to the bedroom there. In the living room, Klotmans noticed Van Doren's parachute and other skydiving gear in close proximity. Feeling wounded and betrayed after being deceived and replaced by her friend, Klotmans resorted to an unthinkable action, which led to a tragic outcome. Later on November 18, 2006, 12 members of the skydiving club, including Van Doren, Klotmans, and Marcel, embarked on a flight over Flanders. The plan involved Van Doren, Klotmans, Marcel, and another skydiver named Tom executing a 4-person formation jump at 13,000 feet. During this formation, they would interlock hands before releasing and deploying their parachutes as they prepared for the jump. Marcel and Tom leaped from the plane as intended. However, it seemed that Klotmans, perhaps due to a delay or intentionally, jumped slightly later than the others. During the freefall, Klotmans was not able to catch up with the group, and at 9,000 feet, Marcel, Van Doren, and Tom broke the formation, preparing to safely open their parachutes. At this point, it became clear that a serious problem had arisen. As Van Doren tried to activate her parachute by pulling the cords, it failed to open. Striving to stay calm, she recalled the emergency procedures from her training, and having dealt with a malfunctioning parachute before, she had successfully deployed the reserve parachute on that previous occasion. However, in this situation, plummeting through the air at around 200 kilometers per hour, she had only 20 seconds or less to perform a life-saving maneuver for a successful landing. Despite her efforts, pulling the reserve cord proved futile, as the parachute remained unresponsive. With her desperation escalating, she persisted in tugging at both the main parachute and reserve cords. Yet no response ensued. Marcel, who was 800 meters above, observed Van Doren, who was a mere 500 meters from the ground, and sensed that something was wrong as her parachute had still not been deployed. But he could do nothing but witness the unfolding horror. In the second desperate attempt, Van Doren tried to undo the cords of the parachute, hoping to activate it, but her fate had already been sealed. At the same time, in the town of Upabik, as these events were unfolding, a woman was outside doing laundry in her garden. A loud noise alerted her to what had happened, and looking up, she saw a person descending from the sky with a parachute towards her garden. This spectacle wasn't unfamiliar, given that her residence was merely a few kilometers from the skydiving club and its landing field. While turning to resume her laundry task, the woman spotted a white fabric entangled on top of her shrubs. Drawing closer, she saw a person lying amidst the bushes. Swiftly, she called her husband, who was also in the garden attending to maintenance duties, and they promptly contacted emergency services. That person was Elle Van Doren. They assumed she was one of the skydivers, but unfortunately, she showed no signs of life. Meanwhile, Marcel found a safe landing spot and ran through the streets, desperately calling out for Van Doren and trying to locate her. Marcel spotted an ambulance and followed it to the nearby site where Van Doren had landed. He rushed towards her, but had to be restrained to allow the emergency crew to approach. Upon the arrival of emergency services, resuscitation efforts were initiated but proved futile. Els Van Doren had succumbed. Marcel vehemently insisted on preserving Van Doren's parachute untouched, asserting the abnormality of both the main and reserve parachutes failing to open. He then contacted her husband, Jan, and delivered the devastating news. Jan hurried to his wife's side, while Tom and Klottermans returned to the parachute club to relay the tragic news of Van Doren's demise to the other members. The club members were deeply affected by the news. Klottermans, feeling overwhelmed, knelt down and let out a sorrowful cry. Elsa's husband, Jan, came to the club to collect her things and found Klottermans there. She offered to get the items, and he noticed her standing still with a strange smile. Klottermans then went towards the changing rooms with Jan following behind. But when they reached there, she suddenly closed the door, locking Jan outside. Jan later mentioned that Klottermans took quite a while before finally coming out with Van Doren's belongings. Meanwhile, at the accident site, the police had gathered Van Doren's parachute and helmet, the latter equipped with a video camera capturing her ill-fated jump. An autopsy conducted to ascertain her state revealed no traces of alcohol or drugs that might have impaired her. Her death was classified as either a murder or a suicide, attributed to multiple fractures and internal bleeding, resulting from the impact of the fall. Suspicions arose within Van Doren's family, pointing toward the possibility of her being murdered by someone within her skydiving club, an individual knowledgeable about how parachutes work. Subsequently, the club members were advised not to attend her funeral, a request that some members, including Van Doren Klottermans, ignored. Jan, in particular, felt deeply hurt, learning that fellow club members were aware of the affair, some of whom he considered friends from his own club membership. To make things worse, Van Doren had falsely told her club friends that she was separated from her husband. Her funeral took place just a day before her daughter Carol's 15th birthday. During this sad occasion, Carol talked to her mother with a heartfelt statement. She mentioned how the family had asked her mother many times to stop skydiving, and expressed how much they wanted her to stay with them. After the concerns about Van Doren's reserve parachute failing, the police started investigating shortly after the funeral. They brought in a parachuting specialist who knew a lot about parachutes to examine Van Doren's parachute and look for any problems. The expert quickly noticed a major issue. A crucial part of her parachute, the pilot chute, was missing. This small extra parachute is important for deploying either the main or reserve parachute. Its intentional removal seemed to be on purpose. Also, there were clear signs of tampering, such as the cut drawing to the pilot chute that activates the main parachute, and one of the straps connected to the emergency parachute. After reviewing the latest body camera footage from Van Doren's failed jump, investigators noticed an unidentified red fabric in front of her face that did not belong to her skydiving equipment. They are still trying to determine where this fabric came from and have asked the residents to search their gardens and surrounding areas for the red item. If found, they stress the importance of handling it carefully as it could contain DNA from the person who tampered with Van Doren's parachute. Sadly, no one has been able to find this key piece of evidence. On the Monday following Alice Van Doren's tragic demise, a remarkable discovery came to light as the pilot chute was mysteriously found by Klopmans. She claimed that on her way back from Marcel's apartment, she spotted the chute hanging from a tree during her journey between Oplab and Genk. Instead of contacting the police directly, Klopmans decided to inform Marcel of her find. Upon learning of the discovery, Marcel called the police, who promptly went to the site of the tree. Upon their arrival, the police encountered a nervous, troubled, and visibly emotional Klopmans. However, their suspicions were aroused regarding Klopmans' miraculous discovery of the pilot chute. She claimed that it was purely coincidental, attributing it to her decision to take a different route home that day compared to her usual journey, being stuck behind a slow-moving tractor that led her to glance upward, where she spotted the chute dangling around 20 meters above. The police, however, remained skeptical, as the fact that the pilot chute was missing was known only to the investigators at that point. At this point, the primary suspects implicated in the presumed murder of Van Doren were her husband Jan, her lover Marcel, and her friend Klopmans. Police conducted searches at Marcel's residence and later cleared him as a suspect. Van Doren's husband, Jan, was also later cleared as a suspect by the authorities. The investigative efforts extended to Klopmans' home, where the police confiscated items such as her phone, laptop, and a diary documenting her emotions. As per her psychiatrist's recommendation, Klopmans was later called in for questioning at the police station in an attempt to gather more information about her relationships with Marcel Van Doren and the circumstances surrounding Van Doren's death. Throughout the interrogation, Klopmans firmly denied any involvement in tampering with Van Doren's parachute and instead tried to shift the blame either onto Marcel, suggesting he had kept Van Doren's equipment during her weekend visits, or onto her husband Jan, with whom she allegedly stored her own equipment during the weekdays. After initial questioning, Klopmans was released and went home. She failed to appear for a second interview scheduled for December 20th, 2006. It was later discovered that she had tried to take her own life that morning by overdosing on sleeping pills and antidepressants. Her mother, Klopmans, found her unresponsive and rushed her to the hospital for emergency treatment. Klopmans wrote to her loved ones about her struggles with grief after losing her close friend, and the immense stress of being a murder suspect. After her recovery, she spent 15 days in a psychiatric facility where she was closely monitored. She had previously been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and depression. This was not Klopmans' first attempt to harm herself. Marcel, who had distanced himself from her, believed her actions were a ploy to get attention and not a genuine attempt to end her life. Marcel thought she had deliberately taken the pills just before her mother was due to return, suggesting that her main aim was to shift the focus away from her possible involvement in Van Doren's death. Marcel assumed the police were closing in on her and catching her in her own lies. After receiving psychiatric care, Klopmans was arrested on January 11, 2007, on suspicion of murdering Alice Van Doren. During her court appearance on January 19, 2007, the judge decided to keep her in custody while the investigation continued. Although asked to take a polygraph test, Klopmans refused and the test was never administered. Further investigation into Alice Van Doren's skydiving equipment revealed that someone had deliberately cut the parachute cords using scissors, likely with their right hand. By March 2007, Klopmans had spent 3 months in prison, undergoing intense questioning without confessing. However, she did admit to sending an anonymous letter to Van Doren, criticizing her for neglecting her family due to her frequent skydiving. Van Doren's partner, Jan, had found the letter but dismissed it as a criticism of Van Doren's absence from her family. It later became clear that Klopmans intended the letter as a warning to Van Doren to end her involvement with Marcel. Klopmans confessed to making anonymous calls to Marcel, timing them when she knew he was with Van Doren, in an attempt to intimidate them. Upon examining Klopmans' automatic activation device, investigators found that she had jumped later than the rest of the team and opened her parachute earlier. They speculated that this gave her a better view of the events unfolding from above. In September 2008, Claude's lawyer managed to get her released on bail, and despite the ongoing investigation, she went back to working at a school. The trial for murder started on September 24, 2010, with the prosecution being very confident that they had enough evidence to convict Klopmans of murder. The reason for the murder, according to the prosecution, was that Klopmans was jealous because she found out her lover, Marcel, was in a relationship with her close friend Van Doren. Earlier, Klopmans had told investigators that she knew she came second to Van Doren in Marcel's eyes. She admitted that Marcel clearly preferred Van Doren over her. The prosecution argued that this led to a strong motive for the alleged murder, as Klopmans desperately wanted to get rid of her romantic rival, Van Doren. Klopmans' defense attorney argued that the prosecution's case relied entirely on circumstantial evidence and unproven accusations. During her testimony, Klopmans claimed she had no long-term plans with Marcel and only got intimately involved with him because of her low self-esteem. At one point, she even tried to shift the blame to Carol Van Doren's daughter, suggesting that she might have wanted revenge against her mother for being away most weekends. Despite her attempts to sway the jury and deflect blame, they ultimately found her guilty of murdering her friend, Els Van Doren, on October 20, 2010, and she was sentenced to 30 years in prison. During her trial, Klopmans consistently maintained her claim of innocence. To prevent her from harming herself again, she was closely monitored. Later, she filed an appeal, arguing that the police had questioned her, without her lawyer present in May 2011. However, her appeal was denied. Nevertheless, after serving 12.5 years in prison, Klopmans was granted conditional release in June 2022, following a third appeal, and is now a free woman. We feel deeply sorry for what happened to Els Van Doren and her family, who had to endure so much after the truth was revealed. Our heartfelt condolences go to her loved ones, who are grieving the loss of her life. Today's video is centered around Resorts World Manila, which opened in 2009, an integrated resort licensed by the Philippine Amusement and Gaming Corporation. Inside it holds 7 hotels, a huge casino operating over 3 floors, theaters, bars, clubs, and restaurants. This case begins in the afternoon of June 1st, 2017. 42-year-old Jesse Javier Carlos was a former tax specialist with the Department of Finance. He and his wife, his high school sweetheart Jen, lived on 1663 Felix Huerta Street with their 3 children. The Carlos family were described as pleasant, polite, their children were well-mannered and well-behaved, and Jesse and Jen were a quiet couple that kept to themselves. Jesse Carlos had come from very little. His mother Teodora used to make and sell baked goods on her knees for hours just to send her children to school. When Jesse was a young boy, his family spent several years fighting eviction notices. As he got older, he started working odd jobs until he decided to study custom brokerage. His cousin said that although Jesse wasn't the sort of person to get awards in school, he was determined to do well, and before long, Jesse Carlos found himself working for the Department of Finance. Between the years of 2000 and 2010, his wealth had seemingly grown by a substantial amount. The family had a personal driver that drove the children to private schools each day, and a rotating series of nice cars were parked outside the home. As well as presents every Christmas, Jesse would give envelopes lined with 1,000 pesos for each of his relatives. However, no one in the neighborhood really knew how Jesse Carlos made his money. Carlos would eventually find himself let go from the Department of Finance for misdeclaring his statement of assets, liabilities, and net worth. At the time of his employment, was making around 15,000 pesos a month, but had declared assets of more than 9 million pesos. In 2012, the Office of the Ombudsman found him unable to reasonably explain the huge disparity between his income and his properties. Following this, was dismissed in 2014. His retirement benefits were forfeited as a result, and he was disqualified for any post in government service. This is when people in the neighborhood said everything started to change for the Carlos family. The car slowly started in debt with the banks alone. He was continuing to sell various assets to fund his ever-growing gambling habits. One of his neighbors, Cecilia, had a son that grew up with Jesse. She said Jesse began gambling and betting early on, playing Caracress in the street with the boys, and later started cockfighting, betting vast amounts of money on this too. On June 1st, Jesse Carlos attended a hearing that involved the government's attempts to seize 6 million pesos worth of his assets. He tried to settle the case for 1.2 million, but the government rejected the offer. At around 4 p.m. on June 1st, 3 men entered Resorts World Manila: Elmer Mitra Jr., Elvin Cruzan, and also Jesse Javier Carlos. They stayed for a couple of hours and had coffee at the Maxim Hotel before leaving and getting into a gray BMW. As the evening rolled around and the nightlife of Resorts World Manila kicked in, Alma Mitra Jr., Alvin Cruzan, and Jesse Javier Carlos were still driving around talking. Alma Mitra Jr. worked at the Philippine National Construction Corporation and was also a lawyer. Alvin Cruzan was a retired police officer and was now working as a casino financier. The conversations that took place in the car that night can never be known. But people speculated that Jesse Carlos may have been getting pressured by Elmer and Alvin to repay his debts. Just before 10 p.m., Carlos pulled a gun out and shot Elmer. Witnesses described hearing more gunshots from inside the car before the car crashed and overturned. Carlos crawled out from the back seat and stumbled off into the night. When police arrived on scene, they recovered 4 9mm casings, 6 bullets, and a 9mm pistol in the car. Both Alma and Alvin were dead from gunshot wounds to the heads. As officers were dealing with the crash and shooting, just before 11 p.m., Jesse Carlos returned home. He changed his clothes and left his house again, heading for the casino in Resorts World Manila. At 11:19, he stopped at a local refueling station where he bought 3 liters of gasoline. At 12:07 a.m., Carlos arrived at the entertainment complex by taxi. He was wearing plain black clothes and carrying a large bag. He exited the taxi, limping slightly as he did so. Unbeknownst to anyone around, inside his bag was a rifle and the container of gasoline. He got in an elevator with 2 women and headed to the parking areas, getting out on the 2nd floor. As he left the elevator, he put on a mask and an ammunition vest, promptly walked into the casino, avoiding the metal detectors and the security guard, took out his rifle and started shooting. Everyone started running for their lives. Security did their best to contain the situation and started trying to evacuate more than 12,000 people from the complex, but the fear and panic proved too much. Stampedes of people crammed into the exits, with some even jumping out of windows. Many people crowded into various cupboards and rooms around the casino, barricading themselves in. At this time, it was unclear how many shooters there were because of the amount of shots that were being fired. Some guests recalled hearing the word terrorists being shouted throughout the building, causing even more panic and uncertainty. In one of the rooms, Carlos took out the gasoline, poured it over one of the gambling tables and set it to light, before throwing his bag containing the ammunition into the flames. He continued moving around the area, setting it on fire as he went. Carlos then entered one of the rooms containing the safes. He shot at the locks on the door before gaining entry to the room with the casino chips in. He spent some time stuffing casino chips into a bag. These chips totaled at just over 113 million pesos, which was the equivalent of just over $2 million at the time. At 1:30 a.m., the building's security and armed police were inside the resort looking for the shooter or shooters, as it remained unclear how many perpetrators there were. Fear was spreading rapidly, and it wasn't long before the main gates of the 4 terminals at the international airport shut, and only passengers and airport personnel already inside were able to move around. Was now wandering around, slowly and aimlessly, seemingly unclear as to where to go and what to do next. More suddenly, a security personnel looked behind a door and saw Carlos. He quickly backed off before attempting to shoot him. They both fired at each other for a few seconds, and Carlos was hit in the process. He then shut the door and slowly headed up the stairs. He entered the Maxim Hotel in the resort, shooting as he went. At 1:46 a.m., he shot into room number 510, grabbed some towels and set them on fire outside in the hallway, before entering the room himself. Before long, police and security cautiously entered the hallway before approaching room 510. Inside the room on the bed was the body of Jesse Javier Carlos. He had covered himself with a thick blanket before setting himself on fire and shooting himself in the head. He was burned beyond any recognition. People were gathered outside of the burning building waiting for news of their loved ones who were trapped inside. It was a truly terrifying and heart-wrenching ordeal for the community. It was confirmed that nobody died from a gunshot, aside from Carlos himself. But the fires he had set had spread quickly, and tragically, many people had suffocated to death inside the building. A few people also died when a ceiling collapsed on them. The number of people that lost their lives that day totaled 38, including Carlos. A further 70 people were left injured due to the stampedes when leaving the building. Police speculate that when Carlos threw his bag of ammunition onto the burning casino table, this only added to the idea that there was more than one shooter in the building and amplified people's fears about leaving the rooms they had barricaded themselves into, and tragically, this meant they had suffocated to death as a result. All the initial suspicions pointed towards an act of terror, with affiliates of Daesh, known more commonly as ISIS, claiming responsibility for the attack. But representatives of the Philippine National Police consistently maintained that the motive was likely a robbery. The shooter was working alone and it was not a terrorist attack. Steve Cutler, chairman of the Overseas Security Advisory Council, also agreed the incident was a robbery and not an act of terrorism. However, the Speaker of the Philippine House of Representatives disagreed with the police and hinted at the possibility of it being a lone wolf terrorist attack. Soon after the incident, Philippine National Police Director General Ronald de la Rosa issued a statement in which he described the attack as being perpetrated by a single shooter, refuting any prior eyewitnesses' statements that believed there was more than one person involved. Rumors and speculation were still running rife, and the shooter's identity was still unknown to the police and public. But an autopsy was carried out as well as using samples of blood that had been left around the casino. And with this, Jesse Javier Carlos' identity was finally revealed. Later that month, the senior inspector of the Manila Police District Homicide Division also confirmed that Carlos was the only person of interest in the shooting of Elmer Mitra Jr. and Alvin Cruzan. This followed forensic testing that was done on the car. Clothing found around Carlos' house also matched the clothes he was seen wearing after the crash in various bits of CCTV footage. On the 7th of June, the House of Representatives Committee on Public Order and Safety and the Committee on Games and Amusement started an investigation into the tragic events. The management of Resorts World Manila admitted there was a lapse in security on that day, and the casino's CEO said upon reviewing the CCTV footage, they realized that some security personnel were not in their assigned areas when Carlos entered the casino. The Philippine Amusement and Gaming Corporation, also known as PAGCOR, regulates casinos and issues the licenses and authority for casinos to operate. On June 9th, suspended the operating license of Resorts World Manila until it deemed that it had rectified its serious security lapses and deficiencies. Armin Gomez, the head of security for Resorts World Manila, saw his credentials severely scrutinized. It came to light that he only had a short stint in training, despite him previously stating he had 10 years of experience as a security practitioner. The House Majority Leader, Rodolfo Farinas, said that the casino's personnel should have been adequately trained. At the time of the attack, Gomez was already on his way home. It came to light that management of the resort were given a heads up to boost their security a matter of days before the attack happened. But for some reason this wasn't followed up on. Senators urged establishments, particularly tourism facilities, to tighten up on security, and in response to the attack, police also increased their presence in shopping centers in Metro Manila. The chief operating officer of Resorts World Manila said the company was going to give 1 million pesos to each of the families of those who died in the attack. The license suspension that had been imposed by PAGCOR was lifted on June 29th, and Resorts World Manila resumed its gambling operations. The casino also hired a private security consultant to tighten up their security procedures. It's been reported that the gambling area on the second floor that was affected by the attack will be converted to be part, seemingly in full swing. The events that transpired that day have had a lasting impact, and the community will likely continue to feel the weight and impact of what happened for many years to come. Case of Sony Milbrook. Sony Milbrook was born in Memphis, Tennessee, USA on February 15, 1981. She grew up in a close-knit family with 2 sisters, 3 brothers, and a large extended family, which allowed her to form a strong bond with her cousin Jenny during her teenage years. In 1998, at the age of 17, Sony became a popular student at her high school. The same year, she met Lelth Moody, a man in his 20s, and began a romantic relationship with him. Unfortunately, the relationship turned out to be abusive, and Eltha's violent behavior left visible marks on Sony's body. Despite this, they had 4 children together, 3 girls and a boy named after Elth. A year later, in 1999, Sony's mother noticed a bruise on her chest. Sony confessed that the bruise was caused by her friend, Leith, who was controlling and often tried to isolate her from her friends and family. In the same year, Sony moved into an apartment in the Fraser neighborhood of Memphis. However, her new home was soon vandalized, with furniture slashed, clothes missing, the television destroyed, food smeared on the walls, and personal hygiene products scattered everywhere, including down the stairs. On the mirror, someone had written, "Kiki loves you" in red nail polish, with Kiki being Leith's nickname. On October 31st, 2000, Sony, her cousin Pamela, and Leith went to a bar called Mirage. While they were there, Leith slapped Sony and threw a drink in her face. Sony and Pamela left the bar and sat in the car, where Sony was visibly shaken and trembling. She asked Pamela to take her home before Leith arrived. Once home, Sony locked and chained the door. An hour later, Leith showed up, yelling and banging on the door. Pamela finally got Leith to leave by threatening to call the police. After Sony calmed down, her cousin left her alone at home. However, later that evening, Pamela got a call saying that Sony was in the hospital. Somehow, Leith had managed to get into the house, and when Sony tried to end the relationship, he violently retaliated. He tore her clothes, beat her on the head, face, chest, arms, and thighs, leaving her with bruises all over her body, a loose tooth, and even temporarily losing consciousness after being choked until she passed out by Leith Moody. Not long after, Sony discovered Elth Moody's birth control pills in her apartment, and he assaulted her again. By late 2008, when Sony was 27, she was working at a Christian academy. She was a reliable employee who always arrived on time, so when she missed work or requested time off, it was usually for significant reasons. One day, she called her employer to say she couldn't come in because her face was badly bruised, and she didn't want the children to see her like that. The director allowed her to wear sunglasses inside the academy, and Sony confided in her boss about how her boyfriend had once chased her in his car, trying to force her off the road. Leith Moody's violence wasn't limited to Sony and their children. In April 2008, he was found parked in an SUV with a firearm, despite being prohibited from possessing one, as a convicted felon. He had already served 2 years in prison for theft, and another 3 for drug possession with intent to sell. On October 6, 2008, the situation between Sony and her boyfriend Leith reached a crisis point. After failing to show up at the academy, Sony sent a distressing text message to her boss at 5 p.m., stating that Leith was holding her hostage in her own home and had been beating her all day. She provided her address, prompting her boss to alert the police. 2 officers responded to the call and arrived at the residence. When they knocked on the door, it was locked from the inside, and there was no response. The fire department was called to break down the door, and upon entering the apartment, the officers saw Leith jumping out of an open window at the back of the apartment. Sony stood in the hallway, visibly distraught and unable to speak. Her 4 children were with her, creating a heart-wrenching scene. Her face and neck were covered in bruises and scratches. Once she calmed down, Sony recounted the events that had unfolded. She and Leith had started arguing, and he had refused to let her leave the house. Sony explained that they had not answered the door earlier because Leith had forbidden her or the children from approaching it or the windows. He had even hurt one of their children by grabbing him and had prevented her from taking him to the hospital. Sony detailed the physical and verbal abuse she had suffered at Leith's hands, including being choked with a baby blanket until she lost consciousness. When the police arrived, Leith had threatened to suffocate her again, vowing to kill her next time. Although the officers searched the area, they were unable to find Leith. Sony and her children eventually left the house in her car. 3 days after the incident, Sony applied for a restraining order against Leith, fearing for her life and wanting to prevent any further contact with him. However, she failed to attend the court hearing on October 23rd, which meant the protection order was never granted. 6 months later, on March 10, 2009, Sony and Leith were still in contact. On that day, Leith was supposed to pick up the children for a doctor's appointment, but instead, he started a fight with Sony, accusing her of having a new boyfriend. The argument quickly escalated, with Leith slapping her, pulling her hair, and yelling death threats as she tried to escape. Sony managed to break free and ran out of the apartment, with Leith chasing after her. He didn't catch her, but instead grabbed their youngest child, an infant, and drove off at high speed. A police patrol, responding to the domestic disturbance, arrived just as Leith was fleeing. The officers attempted to stop him, but he evaded them and escaped. By early 2010, Sony, then 28 years old, was studying at Southeast Tennessee Community College. Her 5th child was 9 weeks old and in fragile health, requiring her to stay home and care for him. In January, Sony and their children moved into the Budget Lodge Motel in Memphis. On the very day they moved in, their arguments were so loud that the motel staff intervened, as they were disturbing other guests. Unfortunately, peace remained elusive, as their fights continued to disturb the neighbors and the management with excessive noise. On January 22nd, a hotel security guard witnessed Leith in a highly agitated state when he arrived at high speed in Sony's car. He began shouting at her while she stood on the second-floor balcony with their children. During the heated argument, Leith threw a bag of groceries at her. The security guard intervened, telling Leith that he needed to keep the noise down and refrain from throwing objects, and that the argument should be continued inside their room. However, Leith responded by telling the guard to mind his own business, locked the car and walked away, with the guard following him to a third-floor room that was not registered under anyone's name. When the guard asked Leith to hand over any hotel keys he had, Leith surprisingly produced keys to 3 different rooms. Despite not being registered as a guest, the following day Leith, Sony, and their children moved to room 222. That evening, the night manager asked Leith to leave, which he did, but he soon returned. The confrontations persisted for a few more days until the same security guard, who had repeatedly warned them, finally asked Leith to vacate the property permanently. As Leith went to the parking lot, the receptionist attempted to calm him down, and the guard warned him not to return that night. Leith got into the car and drove away. On January 26th, Sony privately shared with Pamela that a lot was going on in her life and that she was currently staying at a motel. She hinted that she had something important to confide in Pamela and promised to get in touch if she ended up leaving the motel or if her boyfriend did. The next day began like any other, with Sony taking her younger kids to daycare and dropping off her oldest at school around 11 a.m. However, things took a turn. When the housekeeping manager knocked on Sony's door, speaking to her through the window, to inform her that they needed to settle their bill or leave the hotel room. He returned several times that day, looking for a response. At around 2:30 p.m., Leith answered the door, telling the manager that his mother would be back soon with the money they owed. But when the hotel security guard checked room 222, he found it empty, with children's clothes, bags, and various items scattered all over the floor. One of the beds was neatly made, which seemed out of place given the state of the room. Later that day, Sony failed to pick up her eldest daughter from school, which was unusual. The school secretary called Christine, the child's maternal grandmother, to come and get her. Christine tried calling Sony, but there was no answer. Growing worried, she discovered that her other grandchildren were still at daycare. Convinced something was wrong, Christine asked her husband to pick up the younger kids while she went to the school. They eventually contacted the police, who arrived at the house around 10:30 p.m. and filed a missing persons report. On January 28th, the housekeeping manager re-entered room 222, which was now vacant, to collect and label the personal belongings that the previous tenants had left behind, apparently to avoid paying their bill. The room contained piles of clothing and a large trash bag, which were both taken to the storage area. After emptying the room, it was thoroughly cleaned and readied for new guests. The following day, on January 29th, James and Rhonda Sargent moved into room 222. Upon moving in, the new tenants immediately noticed a strong, unpleasant odor in the room. They attempted to mask it by burning incense, but this effort was unsuccessful. During their search for the source of the smell, they discovered that the previous tenants had also tried to hide it, as evidenced by the scented tissues they found stuck in the tiles and ceiling vents. The smell was most pronounced when someone sat on the bed. On January 29th, the Memphis Police Department's Missing Persons Unit visited the hotel to ask about Sony's whereabouts, as it was the last place she was seen. However, the officers did not search room 222. Leith was found on February 2nd at around 7 p.m. in Sony's car, which was parked at a shopping center. He was arrested for stealing the vehicle and held in police custody for 48 hours. During that time, he was questioned about Sony's disappearance. Leith said the last time he saw her was on January 26th, when they met at 7 a.m. in the hotel parking lot, went to the room, were intimate, and then went back outside. According to Leith, Sony let him take her car keys because she planned to use her social benefits and a school loan to buy a new car. However, investigators discovered that Leith had actually been staying at a different hotel, making it unlikely that he spent nights in the car, especially considering the snow during that period. On February 3rd, police found a debit card with Sony's name, along with several recent purchase receipts inside the car. On the same day, police examined the clothes that had been stored at the hotel, searching for DNA or other evidence, but they found nothing. This lack of progress added to their frustrations, and as a result, Leith had to be released due to insufficient evidence linking him to Sony's disappearance. Meanwhile, Sony's cousin and her mother had the painful task of going to the hotel to collect Sony's belongings. Sony's cousin had a terrible premonition, but unfortunately, she did not find anything to support her feelings. On February 4th, the police went to Moody's uncle's house, where they found a DVD player that had been taken from the hotel room in Sony's wallet. Moody had given these items to his cousin, who told the police that Leith had borrowed the DVD player on January 24th, saying he wanted to watch a movie. Leith was seen driving a red car that day. Later, when the cousin asked Leith why he hadn't picked up the children on January 27th, Leith avoided the question. When asked about Sony, Leith left the DVD player and wallet in a bag and quickly left the house. James and Rhonda Sargent asked to be moved from room 222 because of the constant bad smell. Since no other rooms were available, they had to move to a different hotel. However, even after the room was cleaned and the carpet was washed in early February, subsequent guests in room 222 still complained about the foul smell, which only slightly improved for a few days. Sony's family, especially her kids, were devastated by her disappearance. Their only hope was for her safe return. On February 4th, homicide detectives visited the hotel where Sony was last seen. By then, her room had been occupied and cleaned at least 3 times. The detectives didn't enter the room, but asked the staff if they had noticed anything unusual, and all said no. On February 7th, James and Rhonda, probably relatives or friends of Sony, returned to the hotel and changed rooms 3 times, including one night in room 222, which was the same room Sony had stayed in. They told the management that the rooms still smelled bad. In March, a deeper cleaning of room 222 was carried out, including the carpets, bedding, bathroom curtains, and window drapes. But to everyone's surprise, the smell didn't go away. It got stronger. The manager talked to the security guard about the issue, and during their conversation, they remembered that Sony had vanished at the end of January. The guard recalled the events from that time and suggested that the manager check room 222 for signs of blood or cleaning products. 10 minutes later, the manager returned and asked the guard to come with him. What they found was horrifying. The 2 men walked into the room to find that the manager had removed the mattress from one bed, leaving only the frame behind. The lower part of the bed frame had a built-in enclosure, which prevented the space underneath from being used as a storage area. However, when they lifted the box spring, they discovered a large empty space that could conceal anything. As they peered through the solid edges of the frame, they stumbled upon a gruesome sight, a decomposing body. They immediately called the police, who arrived at the scene shortly after. Upon inspection, the bed frame was found to have marks all over it, with 2 broken wooden areas near the headboard. A towel and a cloth bag were discovered between the legs of the body, which was dressed in a shirt, but was naked from the waist down. The autopsy conducted by the forensic team revealed that the cause of death was strangulation using a coaxial cable. The cable was wrapped around the victim's neck, under one arm, around the chest, and ended at the back. According to the forensic examiner, it would have taken at least 2 to 3 minutes of continuous pressure to cause death. DNA analysis matched Sony's genetic profile, which included female markers. Additionally, male genetic material was found on 5 parts of the cable. The main theory was that Sony was already dead when she was reported missing, and that Leith had used the coaxial cable from the DVD player he had borrowed from his cousin, suggesting premeditation. Leith was detained by the police shortly after, although not for the discovery of Sony's body. He was arrested on a separate charge of possessing a firearm, despite a prior felony conviction. Despite this, he was considered a person of interest at the time of his arrest, as he was the last person seen with Sony alive. Furthermore, he was found in Sony's car when he was arrested and taken to the detention facility in Mason on March 18th. Police have launched an internal investigation to find out why the case took such an unusual turn. They acknowledged that the family deserved answers and explained that despite their eagerness to solve the case, the officers had taken a wrong turn that led them away from the room. The police also stated that they had never dealt with a situation like this before, saying that the discovery was more astonishing than fiction, and highlighted the tragedy of domestic violence. However, they regretted that the room had been cleaned and rented out multiple times since Sony's death, which made it difficult for them to collect evidence. Rhonda, one of the first tenants to occupy the room where Sony's body was found, expressed skepticism about the police explanation when she spoke to the media. She pointed out that if the officers had asked to enter the room during their January visit, she and her husband would have let them in. Rhonda argued that unlike her and her husband, the officers should have been able to recognize the smell of a decomposing body and found Sony much sooner. Finally, the time arrived to bid a loving and dignified farewell to Sony. On March 24th, her funeral took place. Following her death, Sony's children were placed in the care of her sister and brother-in-law. By April 1st, they had begun the process of obtaining legal guardianship of the children. She acknowledged that while the children were the primary victims of the tragedy, the lives of all family members were severely disrupted. She vowed that although she couldn't bring her sister back, she was resolute in providing for Sony's children, ensuring they received the necessities like food, clothing, and toys, and keeping them together as a family unit. Sony had benefited from a social program that refilled her debit card for grocery purchases on a regular basis. Shortly before her disappearance, the card was replenished as part of her tax refund. The police were able to track the card's movements, which led them to Leith, who was found with the card. Their investigation showed that the card was used on February 1st, for days after Sony went missing. At a convenience store she regularly visited on the 1st of each month to withdraw cash using her electronic benefit transfer card. The police visited the store and asked the owner to share the footage from the 16 security cameras. The surveillance system had captured footage of a man wearing yellow clothing using Sony's card at 11:38 a.m. On February 1st, he bought a bottle of orange juice, withdrew some cash, and purchased a cigar. After making the purchases, the man returned to a car driven by another person. In February 2014, nearly 4.5 years after the crime, Leith's trial finally began. By this time, the budget lodge hotel where the couple had stayed had closed down. Leith maintained his innocence, while the prosecutor described the events as a tragic and ugly culmination of a tumultuous relationship. In contrast, the defense attorney highlighted the lack of concrete evidence, including witnesses and physical proof, and disputed the prosecution's speculations. The defense attorney brought to attention a crucial piece of evidence, a fingerprint found on the bed frame that did not belong to Leith, suggesting the possibility of an alternate perpetrator. He also mentioned that Sony had been involved with other men in the past, which could have led to her murder. The attorney emphasized that Leith had no prior arrests for domestic violence against Sony. Furthermore, he revealed that Sony had moved back in with Leith due to a rat infestation at a relative's house where she was previously staying. On February 6th, a video was shown in court, which captured Leith using a prepaid Sony card just 4 days after the murder. While the defense team suggested that Leith's calm behavior during the transaction suggested he was innocent, the prosecution saw it as a sign of a cold-blooded and ruthless individual who was unbothered by the crime he had allegedly committed. On February 7, 2014, Leith was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. 3 days later, on February 10th, Leith appealed the sentence, arguing that the court had made an error by considering his past history of domestic violence, and that the evidence presented was insufficient. However, on July 7, 2015, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction, confirming the sentence. Today's case takes us to the small village of Alve Church in northeast Worcestershire, England. In December 1996, the media was dominated by the story of a disturbing road rage incident, with the ferocity of the attack leaving many people in shock. 25-year-old Lee Harvey worked as a bus driver, and his mom Maureen said all he wanted in life was to be a husband and a good father. His parents described him as cheeky and funny, always bringing so much good energy to everything. Lee had a young daughter, Danielle, whom he doted on, and Maureen said they were like two peas in a pod. He was separated from Danielle's mother, but the pair remained friendly and supportive of each other in raising their daughter together. 27-year-old Tracy Andrews had dreams of becoming a model and was working as a bartender when she met Lee in a club in 1994. Tracy also had a daughter 1 year apart in age from Lee's. She gave birth to her baby girl, Carla, when she was 21. But the relationship with her then partner was tumultuous, and less than a year later, the relationship ended. As soon as she and Lee met, the couple's connection was instant. They had a passionate and fast-moving relationship, and friends and family said they were inseparable from the get-go. It was said that Tracy was always incredibly possessive over her partners, and the relationships were always volatile. Lee was also a jealous person, and fights would often break out between the pair over the attention the other might get. Ex-partners said that Tracy had a vicious temper, often getting violent with them. Arguments between her and Lee would escalate and get out of control quickly, and violent outbursts would often ensue. Despite this, Lee moved into Tracy's flat after just 3 months, but he would often return to his parents' house as Tracy would frequently kick him out, throwing his belongings into bin bags. Despite everyone around the pair seeing how toxic the relationship was, Lee would always move back in and the pair would try and work things out. Lee's mom Maureen said that everyone felt the relationship was bad news from the beginning. She said she could tell straight away that Tracy was controlling, paranoid, and extremely insecure. Tracy revealed to Maureen that she had had a difficult childhood and had never recovered from her dad walking out of the family home when she was 6 years old. The more time that passed, the more the relationship continued to grow toxic, dangerously unhealthy and codependent. Maureen said the arguments became the only predictable thing about the pair. Neighbors would often hear the couple shouting at each other for hours at a time, and police were called on numerous occasions to the flat to break up the fights. Maureen was starting to notice some changes in her son that she didn't like. After finding out that Tracy had bitten Lee on the neck during a vicious fight, she called Tracy, telling her the relationship couldn't continue and that it was unhealthy for the pair to carry on seeing each other. But hers and everyone else's words fell on deaf ears, and the couple carried on. Tracy soon fell pregnant, and although a shock, everyone hoped this might help the couple stop fighting and focus on what was now the most important thing. Lee was over the moon at the prospect of becoming a father for a second time, but just a short time later, Tracy announced that she had suffered a miscarriage when she fell down some steps as she was out shopping. After 6 months, and much to everyone's concern, Lee proposed to Tracy and the pair set about planning their wedding. After another day of explosive rows, Tracy and Lee went to the Milbrook pub in an attempt to calm things down and patch things up. They left late into the evening and began the short drive back to the flat they shared in the Beck's Alve Church in Worcestershire. Car pulled up outside the Harvey house. As Lee would often return to his parents' home during fights with Tracy, Maureen didn't think too much of it, listening out for him to walk through the door and explain what had happened this time. But Lee wasn't there, and his parents instead opened the curtains to see police officers walking up the driveway. The police explained that Lee and Tracy had been involved in a serious road rage attack as they were driving home from the pub, and tragically, Lee hadn't survived. He had been stabbed over 40 times, and a pathologist later described the attack as frenzied. Lee's fiancée Tracy had survived, and she was at the Royal Alexandra Hospital being treated for her injuries. A man staying in one of the cottages alongside the road the attack happened on had come out of the house that night and found Tracy standing by Lee's car while Lee lay motionless in the road, covered in blood. The neighbors helped Tracy phone the police, and officers quickly arrived on scene. But by the time the police got there, Lee was already dead. Tracy told police that she and Lee had left the pub in Lee's car just before 10 p.m. Shortly into the journey, Lee overtook a dark-colored Ford Sierra. This had started what Tracy called a cat and mouse chase. The car began tailgating them, flashing the lights, and both cars began driving at high speeds down the narrow lane. Tracy said that she had shouted at Lee to slow down and ignore the car, but he didn't listen. The Ford Sierra eventually overtook them, and Lee got out before an altercation took place between the driver and Lee. The passenger in the other car also exited the vehicle, and a physical fight broke out. Lee and Tracy were both hit, and Tracy was knocked to the floor. When she got up, she realized Lee had been stabbed during the fight. The people in the other car fled the scene, and Tracy cradled Lee with him dying in her arms. Lee's parents, Maureen and Ray, straight away had some questions. Why on earth would someone stab their son to death, leave his fiancée alive, seemingly unharmed, and now a key witness in the case? Why didn't she phone us? Ray asked. Maureen and Ray were distraught, but they needed Tracy to talk to them about what had happened that night. They both continuously tried and failed to get hold of Tracy after she was discharged from hospital. They finally got through to Tracy's stepfather, who said she hadn't rung them from the hospital as she'd forgotten their number, something that Ray and Maureen found impossible to believe, given the amount of time she had called their home looking for Lee after a fight. Tracy's avoidance of Lee's family was concerning, and her story and reaction to the event after the fact was raising even more questions than answers. Maureen said despite the strange and seemingly far-fetched reason behind her not talking to them after Lee was killed, she was still determined to believe in Tracy's story and support her. She said, "The police had told us she'd been attacked as well, so how could she have been involved? She might have been the last woman in the world I'd wanted Lee to end up with, but for all her faults, I was convinced she loved him." With uncertainty and doubt about what had happened that night, and with rumors still swirling, on December 3rd, Tracy took part in a press appeal, and the police asked the public for something, anything that might help them catch the two men in question. As she held Maureen's hand, she recounted her version of events, giving descriptions of the men and talking about the same cat and mouse story that had led to the attack. Tracy then said that she urged the driver of the car to come forward, saying he was not in trouble and had done nothing wrong. The media had already been given one version of events by the police, but Tracy suddenly gave a totally different set of times. At this point, detectives stepped in to stop Tracy from talking, and the press conference was abruptly brought to an end. Tracy's appeal raised eyebrows with the media, and people wondered why she was not holding the driver responsible when the driver had, according to Tracy, been the one to initiate the fight. Police were shocked as this was not anything they had agreed upon. They were definitely looking for the driver as he was an accessory to murder, possibly even a co-conspirator in the case. As the room started to empty, amongst the reporters began. Tracy's imitation of what she called the starry-eyed attacker was enough to convince many people that she was capable of that kind of rage and anger she described the attackers as having. One reporter in particular made a bold claim and outright said he believed they had all just in fact interviewed the real killer. Although it was a devastating thought, Lee's family were questioning Tracy even more. Her story just didn't make any sense, and more holes were starting to appear in it. Fortunately, the press conference did generate something for the police. Two witnesses came forward and said they had seen Lee's white Ford Escort that night, and he was driving past them on a junction about to turn onto the lane he was killed on. But out of nowhere, Lee's car suddenly braked and stopped in the road. The witnesses said no other cars were following them, and there seemed to be no reason for the car braking, and with this they carried on driving. A day after the press appeal, Tracy attempted suicide by taking an overdose of around 200 pills. She left notes saying she couldn't carry on without Lee. She was taken to hospital where her stomach was pumped and she spent the following 2 days recovering. Maureen and Ray visited Tracy in hospital, and while they were there, Tracy grabbed Maureen's hand and said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I've done." After this, she went quiet and turned her head away, and Maureen and Ray left. Ray said to his wife, "That's the closest thing we're going to get to a confession." Tracy's story just wasn't adding up, and the police could find no evidence that a road rage incident had taken place at all. Investigators had thoroughly checked over the road the car chased in the attack allegedly happened on. It was a narrow, single country lane, and if two cars had been speeding and overtaking each other, there would likely be tire marks or something that pointed towards a high-speed chase. But the road and grass along the side were completely clear. The location of the blood in the road in relation to where Tracy had said the attack had happened also didn't match up. And despite Tracy saying the attack had happened outside the vehicle, Lee's blood was found in the back seat of his car. No witnesses could attest to seeing the same dark car Tracy spoke about, and there was a substantial amount of time after Lee had been stabbed before Tracy raised the alarm. Nobody living near or driving along the road at the same time saw or heard anything apart from one person, a child living in one of the cottages near the lane. The 9-year-old said she had heard an argument that night, but only remembered hearing 2 voices, not 4, and it sounded like the car was stationary and parked. Examination of Lee's body found almost 100 strands of Tracy's hair in his hand, which pathologists later determined had to have been taken from Tracy's head with considerable force, possibly during a physical fight. As well as wounds from a blade, some marks on Lee's body indicated that scissors may have been used. This pointed towards a Swiss Army knife being the murder weapon. Blood on her clothing showed a splash pattern rather than a transfer of blood from holding Lee as he lay dying, as Tracy had claimed. Testing was done on all of Tracy's clothing that she had been wearing that night, which confirmed there was a blood stain on the inside of her boot. Forensic experts found the outline of the shape of a penknife imprinted on the inside of her boot. During her stay at the hospital, she visited the bathroom 6 times in 3 hours, and it was later revealed that she must have disposed of the knife somewhere in the toilets of the hospital. The same day Tracy was discharged following her overdose, police arrested her in connection with the murder of Lee, and on December 19th, she was formally charged. She vehemently denied any involvement and adamantly stuck to her story. To everyone's surprise, including the police, the judge made a decision that no one was expecting. Tracy was granted bail while she was awaiting trial and moved in with her mother and stepfather. It was another blow for Lee's family, and it was a highly unusual and controversial decision. Bail on a murder charge is not granted unless the court is absolutely satisfied that there is no significant risk that the person would commit an offense that would likely cause physical or mental injury to another person. In February 1997, was finally laid to rest, with hundreds turning out to pay their respects and show their love and support for the Harvey family. In July that year, 7 months after Lee's murder, Tracy's trial began at Birmingham Crown Court. While on the stand, Tracy's defense team asked her about her relationship with Lee, as well as her version of events. Tracy stuck to her story and maintained that although the couple fought a lot, she would never go as far as to kill him. She said they broke up all the time, but they truly loved each other and always came back together stronger than before. But a particular revelation Tracy used to highlight an example of this left Lee's family shocked. Tracy revealed that the miscarriage she had told everyone she'd had was actually an abortion that she had got after another fight with Lee. Maureen was devastated and called Tracy a lying bitch, to which Tracy angrily responded by shouting, pointing and demanding Maureen be removed from the courtroom. The judge let Maureen stay, but this outburst gave the prosecution the perfect lead into their cross-examination of Tracy. After a few short weeks on trial, Tracy Andrews was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 14 years to serve. The judge said, "Only you know precisely what went on that night, but we have all seen the awful consequences." A year into her sentence, she filed an appeal claiming she was the victim of a miscarriage of justice because of damaging publicity surrounding her case. This appeal was denied. A year after this, in 1999, Tracy wrote a letter to her lawyer, finally admitting she did stab Lee to death, but maintained that it was self-defense. She said it happened in slow motion after a fight between the pair had escalated and Lee pulled a knife on her. They struggled for a while and she said she had lost control and stabbed him. She claimed she felt sick and ashamed and hated herself for doing that to Lee and his family. The self-defense claim was disputed by many as most of the stab wounds were to Lee's back, and people suspected this came when he was trying to retreat and escape to his car to get away from the attack. A woman that Tracy had had a relationship with while in prison said that Tracy had attacked and strangled her for talking to an ex-girlfriend. She said she was opposed to Tracy ever being released and believed she would kill again if she was let out. Tracy Andrews served the recommended time of 14 years before being released from prison in 2011. She was ordered not to go within 25 miles of Lee's family. Tracy has since married, had reconstructive surgery to alter her appearance, and changed her name multiple times. For Lee's family and friends, the pain of knowing that Tracy is out of prison weighs heavily on them. Maureen wrote a book about the case and hers and her family's experiences. She said whenever she looks over old newspaper articles or letters from the case, it feels as if she is looking at someone else's family. Lee Harvey was charming and funny, honest and caring, and his parents often expect him to come walking through the door to see them. His family cherished the good memories and will always remember Lee for the great son and father he was. The case of Natalie Holloway, 18-year-old Natalie Holloway, who disappeared while on a trip to Aruba, an island in the southern Caribbean Sea near Venezuela. In May 2005, a group of 124 students from Mountain Brook High School, accompanied by 7 chaperones, traveled to Aruba to celebrate the start of their adult lives. The students stayed at the Holiday Inn and had access to beaches, palm trees, restaurants, and local entertainment venues. They spent 5 unforgettable days on the island, enjoying themselves with swimming, sunbathing, dancing, and partying. However, on the day of their return, Natalie Holloway was nowhere to be found. Her belongings, phone, and passport were still in the hotel, but she had vanished. Her mother, Elizabeth Twitty, was the first to raise the alarm and reported her concerns to one of the chaperones. Elizabeth recalled that at that moment her heart sensed something was wrong as her daughter was obedient and always stayed in touch. Natalie's mother and stepfather immediately flew to Aruba to search for her. Upon arriving, Elizabeth was able to find out more information than the police did as the authorities seemed uninterested in starting a search. The police told Elizabeth that cases like this are not rare, and that people often miss their planes or get lost in bars or with new acquaintances. However, Elizabeth knew her daughter and was convinced that something was seriously wrong. Natalie Holloway was last seen leaving Carlos and Charlie's nightclub with 17-year-old Jan, a local regular who had offered her a drink. They left with 2 other young men in a silver Honda car. For hours later, Natalie's mother, Elizabeth, contacted the police again with concerning information, leading to the detention of the trio. Initially, Vanderslot denied knowing Natalie, but later admitted to leaving the bar with her. They drove around, visited the beach, and then dropped her off near the hotel. His friends Deepak and SES Kalpo confirmed his account. Natalie was born on October 21, 1986, in Clinton, Mississippi, to Elizabeth and David Edward Holloway. Her parents loved each other dearly, but divorced after 13 years. Natalie and her brother stayed with their mother, but their father remained supportive emotionally and financially. In 2000, Elizabeth remarried to George Twitty, and Natalie moved to Mountain Brook. The move was smooth, and she made new friends easily due to her sociable nature. Her family was devout, attending church every Sunday, which influenced Natalie's upbringing. Relatives remembered her as kind, modest, and beautiful with a radiant smile. Natalie was an excellent student, engaged in dance and participated in various clubs. She dreamed of pursuing a career in medicine and had chosen a local university for a substantial scholarship. At the time, she had promising life prospects and was excited about an upcoming trip. Elizabeth believed her daughter was unlikely to trust a stranger or get into a car with him. Surveillance footage from the bar confirmed her suspicions, showing Natalie's behavior changed after drinking a beverage offered by Jan, suggesting she was under the influence of some substance. The staff at Carlos and Charlie spoke well of Natalie, but Vandersloot had a questionable reputation, often behaving poorly, indulging in gambling and consuming forbidden substances. He had previously recorded and uploaded videos of his exploits to the internet, but was never held accountable due to his father's influence as a well-known lawyer aiming for a judgeship. The disappearance of Natalie sparked a nationwide search, with the island authorities launching an extensive operation to find her. Volunteers, divers, and specially trained dogs were deployed to cover a vast area. The government even declared a public holiday, and 50 Marines combed the coastline. An airplane equipped with thermal imaging scanned over 40 kilometers of terrain, but Natalie seemed to have vanished into thin air. On June 30th, investigators discovered that there was no footage of Natalie entering a building, which contradicted the statements of Jan and the Calpo brothers. The police brought them in for questioning again, and this time the younger Wanda Slut unexpectedly changed his story. He claimed to have dropped Natalie off at a location without surveillance, not near the hotel, and added that he saw a figure in black moving towards her. Hotel security staff who were on duty that night were detained, with investigators suspecting they might have intercepted Natalie on her way. On June 9th, detectives arrested the suspicious trio, and one of the security guards shared a cell with the Calpo brothers. The guard learned a crucial detail. Suddish confessed that he and Deepak had lied to cover for their friend, leaving Jan alone with Natalie on the beach. The security guards were released on June 13th, and on June 17th, another suspect, Steve Gregory Cruz, a DJ, was detained. The police suspected his involvement in Natalie's disappearance. On June 22nd, Paulus Vandersloot was brought in for questioning and detained, but he was released on June 26th due to insufficient evidence. Jan offered a third explanation of the events, trying to shift the blame onto the Calpo brothers, claiming he parted ways with Natalie near his home, and she left with them. However, his story was not taken seriously. A lawyer defended Suddish and Deepak, and on July 4th, after a brief trial, the Calpo brothers were released. Jan Vandersloot, born on August 6, 1987, in Arnhem, Netherlands, was one of 3 brothers in a large family. He was a good student, excelled in sports, and planned to attend St. Leo University in Florida. Jan's childhood was marked by a strained relationship with his mother Anita, an art teacher, who considered him an incubator liar. He grew up rebellious, often ran away from home, and fell in with a bad crowd, developing a penchant for gambling. Despite this, he presented himself as cool and fearless to his friends. Locals were suspicious of Jan's lenient attitude, fearing it would lead to trouble. However, he was popular among girls and often took advantage of them. As the investigation into the suspects continued, the search for Natalie persisted. U.S. authorities closely monitored the progress and provided substantial financial support. Despite the scrutiny, the Holloway family was desperate to find their daughter alive and announced a monetary reward, which initially started at $50,000. As hope dwindled, the reward increased to $1 million. Additionally, $100,000 was offered for information leading to the location of her remains, which later increased to $250,000. During this time, the investigation hit several dead ends. However, after the reward announcement, new witnesses emerged. One claimed to have seen Jan with the Calpo brothers at a local night spot between 2:30 and 3 a.m. Another witness claimed to have seen several suspicious men hiding a woman's body at a dump on the afternoon of May 30th. However, these statements led the investigation astray, and after numerous checks, their claims were not corroborated. On August 26th, the police detained the Calpo brothers and another young man, but these actions were unrelated to the case. The arrest was more about intimidation and an attempt to get them to talk. Ultimately, on September 3, 2005, all 4 were released on bail. A week and a half later, the court removed all restrictions and prohibitions, as none provided any substantial leads to the investigation. Jan Vandersloot was detained for 3 months, But after his release, he sought to capitalize on his notoriety by giving interviews and appearing on TV shows. In these appearances, he claimed that Natalie Holloway had flirted with him and offered to have sex. But he declined because he didn't have a condom. However, during one show he became aggressive and threw a glass at the interviewer. A journalist who was targeted by Jan's glass-throwing incident held a grudge against him and worked with authorities to place a bug in a friend's car. The bug captured Jan confessing to witnessing Natalie's death. He claimed that they had sex on the beach, but afterward she began shaking, lost consciousness, and eventually died. Jan and a friend then disposed of her body at sea. Despite this confession, Jan managed to avoid consequences by denying the statement on another TV show, claiming he had only told his friend what he wanted to hear. In 2007, Jan released a book, The Case of Natalie Holloway, My Own Account of Her Disappearance in Aruba, in which he presented his side of the story, and apologized to Natalie's family. By this time, the official investigation had largely stalled. In 2008, 2 new witnesses came forward. The first reported seeing Jan and his father on the beach around 4 a.m. on the night Natalie went missing. The younger Van der Sloot appeared disheveled, and the witness saw him arguing with his father in a car before they drove away. However, Paulus van der Sloot had an alibi for the night in question. The second witness was Jan's former girlfriend, who recalled that Jan had once made a suspicious comment about being able to dispose of someone's body. However, this was not considered a strong lead, given Jan's history of lying and exaggeration. Jan and the Kalpo brothers were detained multiple times, but released due to lack of evidence. The Holloway family hired a private investigator who, along with Natalie's father, conducted their own investigation, interviewing locals and searching the landfill. During this time, they uncovered several oversights by the local police, including failure to interview Natalie's classmates or hotel room neighbors. It was also discovered that someone had used Natalie's hotel keys several times on the night of her disappearance, and that her mobile phone and toothbrush had been left behind. A male DNA was found on her toothbrush. The investigation ultimately revealed that the Aruban authorities had been negligent in their handling of the case. Jan's father, Paulus, died of a heart attack in 2010, reportedly due to the stress and shame of his son's actions. After his father's death, Jan attempted to blackmail the Holloway family, offering to reveal the truth for $250,000. The family agreed to meet with him and paid in advance of $25,000. During the meeting, provided yet another version of events, claiming that Natalie had resisted his advances, which enraged him, and that he had pushed her, causing her to hit her head and lose consciousness. He then buried her body in a building foundation. However, the police investigation revealed that Jan's claims were false, as the house he pointed to had long been built, and its foundation was fully set at the time of Natalie's disappearance. Jan fled to Peru with the money, but unfortunately, the consequences did not catch up with him immediately. On June 1, 2010, the body of 21-year-old Stephanie Flores Ramirez was discovered in a hotel room in Lima, Peru. She had been severely beaten, and the cause of her death was determined to be a neck fracture. Surveillance cameras quickly helped identify the criminal, and soon after, Jan was arrested and taken to the police station. He explained that he had met Stephanie at a casino, and after playing poker, they decided to continue their acquaintance in his hotel room. However, when Stephanie accessed his laptop and discovered his connection to Natalie Holloway's death, she became frightened and wanted to leave, realized what had alarmed her, became enraged and struck her until she died. Jan was captured on his way to Chile and confessed to the crime on the 4th day of his arrest. The news shocked residents in the U.S., especially as it occurred exactly 5 years after Natalie's disappearance. Elizabeth Twitty expressed her grief, noting that justice had finally been served, albeit at the cost of another life. Jan was sentenced to 28 years in prison on January 11, 2012, for the premeditated crime against Stephanie Flores Ramirez. He was also ordered to pay $75,000 in compensation to the Ramirez family. In 2014, Jan was transferred from Pedres Gordas prison to Calakpala prison, where he met a Peruvian woman who visited another inmate in 2010. They got married, but it turned out Jan was using her for his own purposes. He showed no signs of remorse or guilt for his actions. Meanwhile, in June 2011, David Holloway filed a petition in an Alabama court to have his daughter Natalie, who had gone missing in 2005, declared legally deceased. Natalie's mother opposed this, hoping that Jan would confess to the crime and face trial. After a hearing, Judge Alan King ruled in favor of the declaration on January 12, 2012. On June 8, 2023, Jan was extradited to the United States and placed in Hoover City Jail in Alabama. The next day, he was charged with extortion and wire fraud, but he pleaded not guilty. However, on October 18, 2023, he entered a plea agreement admitting to murdering Natalie Holloway. He confessed to fatally bludgeoning her with a cinder block on May 30, 2005, and disposing of her body in the ocean for sharks to consume. Unfortunately, the confession made as part of the plea deal could not be used in court. Jan was sentenced to 20 years, which would run concurrently with his prison term in Peru. Natalie Holloway's disappearance remains one of the most notorious missing person cases in the U.S., and it is still an open case in Aruba. A series of cover-ups, corrupt deals, and bureaucratic delays effectively allowed the murder of an innocent young woman to go unpunished, despite global attention to the investigation. Christmas Eve, 1991. Sue and Clive welcomed their daughter Alice into the world. Described by friends and family as a loving and empathetic person, outgoing, quick-witted, and fun, 24-year-old Alice Ruggles was adored by those in her life. People that knew her said she had the ability to cheer anyone up and was a natural entertainer. She was mischievous, funny, and loved socializing. Alice was from a close-knit family and was the third of 4 children. She and her siblings grew up in the quiet, rural Leicestershire village of Turlangton. She attended Leicester High School for Girls and from there went on to Northumbria University to study product design. Alice discovered fencing at the age of 11, and the sport quickly became a big part of her life. She went on to represent her home county of Leicestershire and the East Midlands region numerous times. At Northumbria University, became the fencing club captain and went on to win the women's EPPE at the Leeds Open in 2012. Alice fell in love with the city of Newcastle and carried on living there after she graduated. She got a job at Sky's Newcastle hub, and it wasn't long before her hardworking attitude paid off, and she was promoted to site coordinator. In October 2015, Alice started talking to Trayman Dillon. Trayman, known to everyone as Harry, was a lance corporal based at Glencoe Barracks in Edinburgh, Scotland, and was training to join the Special Reconnaissance Regiment. At the time he and Alice connected, he was serving in Afghanistan, and the pair started talking over Facebook. In January 2016, the couple met in person for the first time, and initially the relationship appeared to be going well. 26-year-old Dillon was caring, attentive, and considerate, and friends said Alice seemed besotted. He and Alice spent a couple of weeks together in Newcastle and then in Edinburgh before he returned to Afghanistan for his final 2-month tour of duty. Dillon returned to the UK in April, and in July, Alice invited him on the family's annual holiday where the pair were inseparable. However, this would not last, and it wasn't long before the cracks began appearing in the couple's short relationship. People in Alice's life started to notice some concerning changes in her. Once outgoing and someone that loved any chance to socialize, Alice was becoming distant and withdrawn. Dillon was becoming more and more critical of her in every way, so much so that it drove Alice further into an isolated state. She began losing a lot of weight and started falling out with friends she was once so close to. After a fight with her housemates, she moved out and into the ground floor flat on Rawling Road in Gateshead, where she lived with one of her work friends, Maxine. The women started contacting Alice, saying they had also been seeing Dillon at the same time she was. Following these claims, she ended the relationship for good in August. But Dillon was not prepared to accept no for an answer, and Alice's mental and physical health began to deteriorate even more over the following months. He bombarded her with calls, texts, and emails. While some messages were apologetic and begging for her to give him another chance, others were threatening and aggressive. He started contacting her family and friends, even texting Sue, referring to her as Mom, and begging her to convince Alice to take him back. He then went on to tell her what a horrible person her daughter was. He was completely obsessed and would stop at nothing to get Alice's attention. Alice initially tried to be sympathetic and kind, feeling bad that he was so affected by the end of relationship. But she soon was left with no choice but to cut him off as the tirade of messages and calls proved too much. He hacked into her social media accounts and threatened to release photos he had secretly taken of her. At the beginning of September, he gained access to Alice's Facebook account and found out that she had started a new relationship with an army officer called Mike. Dylan was completely enraged and contacted Mike, lying and telling him that Alice was still seeing him at the same time. On September 30th, Dylan drove to Alice's flat, repeatedly ringing the doorbell and then hiding when she looked outside. She knew in her gut it was him and didn't open the door. A few hours later, Dylan climbed the fence into the back garden and knocked on Alice's window as she was in her bedroom. When she opened the curtains, she saw flowers and chocolates on the windowsill, and Dylan slowly backing away with his arms in the air. As he drove back to Edinburgh, he left a sinister voicemail on her phone that said in part, "I just wanted to give you flowers and chocolates to prove that no, I don't want to kill you. I'm not intending to kill you. That's all I wanted to say." Desperate for help and with the situation getting worse, Alice contacted the non-emergency police number 101 for advice. They logged the incident as harassment and issued a police information notice, also known as a PIN. A PIN is issued as a caution where there are allegations of harassment made, but it is not a court order, nor does it give you a criminal record, and signing it does not admit to any wrongdoing on the perpetrator's part. On October 3rd, this warning was communicated to Dylan in his barracks. It was arranged for his major at the Edinburgh barracks to issue the police information notice, although national guidance stated this should be done by a police officer in person unless exceptional circumstances prevented them. Despite the PIN being issued, he sent Alice a parcel containing a letter and some other items. In the letter, he told her he knew she'd the police, and he was now in a lot of trouble for it. He told her they had taken his laptop and phone away from him, but this was another lie. In the letter, he also said, "I'm in a lot of shit now, but hope you feel happy now. I'm sending you everything I have that reminds me of you as you belong to another man. Wishing you too a happy life. I will never come in your life again." Alice contacted the police for a second time. She told people she felt palmed off at the response from the police and was distraught and defeated, feeling nothing could or would be done to stop Dylan. She chillingly said to her sister Emma she felt the police would only respond when he stabs me. The 24-year-old was living in a state of fear, constantly looking over her shoulder. She asked to be driven home to her front door each day by a colleague, and once inside she would immediately double lock it. During the evening of October 10th, Dylan drove down to her flat again. He climbed into the back garden and took a photo of the back window and bathroom before driving back to Edinburgh. Her supervisor Paul gave her a lift home, dropping her straight at her door at 5:30 p.m. She messaged some friends, showing them an outfit she had bought, and briefly chatted to her boyfriend Mike. The messages then abruptly stopped. Alice's flatmate Maxine returned home just before 6:30. Alice Ruggles was pronounced dead at 7:30 p.m. Her throat had been slit at least 6 times and she had suffered 24 injuries in total. The coroner concluded that Alice had died from catastrophic blood loss. The police quickly identified Dylan as their only suspect. Officers started running his car number plate through the automated number plate recognition system. They quickly got a hit when his car was clearly picked up traveling from Edinburgh down to Newcastle earlier that day. Just before midnight, Dylan was arrested in his barracks on suspicion of murder. At 3:24 a.m., Dylan arrived at Gateshead Police Station for questioning. During an interview, he admitted he had traveled to Newcastle that day, but said it was because he wanted answers and closure about why the relationship had ended. He denied entering her flat, claiming that Alice was the one that came out and approached him. He told officers that she said she had heard stories about men killing their girlfriends, and she was scared he would do the same to her. Dylan said he reached out to hold her hands, and she scratched him across the face. After this, he drove away, he said. But what had actually happened was Dylan drove down and parked near Alice's flat, waiting for her to return from work. While waiting, He started messaging a girl on Tinder, making plans to meet up later that night. Around 6 p.m., he climbed over the back wall and forced his way in through the window. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen and cornered Alice as she went into the bathroom. He knelt on her back to pin her down and slit her throat, cutting through to her spine. While Dylan was in custody, police discovered Alice's blood on his steering wheel and on his Help for Heroes wristband. Analysis of her phone records placed the phone en route to Edinburgh too. A few hours later, Dylan was charged with the murder of Alice Ruggles. His trial began in April 2017 at Newcastle Crown Court, and he was still pleading not guilty to murder, but the overwhelming amount of evidence meant he and his defense team had no choice but to change his story. Dylan claimed that he showed up at Alice's flat with the intention of getting his belongings when a violent argument ensued. Alice attacked him with a knife, and in the process of trying to hurt him, she had inflicted the injuries upon herself. He then said that as Alice lay dying, she spoke of how much she hated her family. Dylan was asked what was going through his head as he looked down at Alice, and his response was that he felt terrible for her father Clive, as he had been unable to protect his daughter in her last moments. The court also heard that a restraining order had been taken out against Dylan by an ex-girlfriend 3 years earlier. After his ex had broken up with him, he tracked her down and spat in her face in the streets while hurling abuse at her and her new boyfriend. Sadly, at the time of Alice's phone calls, Northumbria police had no knowledge about the earlier restraining order. After an 11-day trial and just 2 hours of deliberations, Dylan was found guilty of the murder of Alice Ruggles and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. Carrying the knife to the flat would have given a 25-year starting point for Dylan to serve in prison, but as he didn't arrive armed with the weapon and had picked it up while he was in the flat, he was sentenced to a 22-year minimum term instead. During his sentencing, Judge Paul Sloan described the murder as utter barbarism and said, "When giving evidence you forgot to even shed a crocodile tear." The police's handling of the case received huge backlash. After the trial, Northumbria police conducted an internal review and identified potential misconduct by officers, which was referred to the Independent Office of Police Conduct. 2 officers then faced disciplinary action over the handling of the case. Northumbria police said they did refer their actions to the Independent Police Complaints Commission, but said no one at the time knew the true threat that Dylan posed. The force have since apologized after the Independent Police Complaints Commission ruled that the officers failed to properly investigate Alice's claims. Gateshead Community Safety Board also carried out a domestic homicide review. The review concluded that Alice had been subject to significant stalking and agreed upon a series of 20 recommendations to help prevent similar incidents from happening again. Her parents Sue and Clive said, "We believe that her death was preventable. We find it difficult to comprehend that although Alice described in her first phone call to the police that she was being stalked and provided ample evidence, the police and the army were unable to support and protect her." Sue and Clive set up the Alice Ruggles Trust, which raises awareness about stalking and coercive control. They work to ensure that stalking offenses result in immediate action, both to protect the victim and to deal effectively with the alleged stalker. They also aims to provide education and training and campaigns for improved legal measures. They also launched the Alice Ruggles Trust Relationship Safety Resource, which is teaching materials and lesson plans that focus on stalking and coercive control. These are freely available to secondary school teachers throughout the UK. In 2020, stalking protection orders were announced by the government. This means that suspected stalkers could be given court orders, blocking them from contacting or approaching their alleged victims, while the police investigate the claims thoroughly. Sue said that new figures show an increase in the number of stalking incidents that were now being recorded by police, and she said this showed that officers were now correctly identifying the crime. Alice Ruggles' spirited, fun, and affectionate personality continues to live on through those that knew her. She made a huge impact in a short space of time. Her family and friends vow to keep her memory alive and hope that her story will continue to help and educate by supporting those that may have experienced similar things and by challenging the law and the handling of similar cases. Most importantly, they vow that Alice's name will not be forgotten and her voice will continue to be heard. The case of Celeste Manno. Celeste Manno was born on November 30th, 1997, in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. She was the youngest of two children to parents Agudero and Tony Manno and grew up with her older brother Alessandro. Although her parents separated when she was young, her father remained involved in her life, providing financial support and maintaining a relationship with his children. Celeste was a sociable and active student who enjoyed sports, dance. Initially, she wanted to become a lawyer and enrolled at the University of Melbourne to study criminal and civil law. However, she later lost interest in law and switched to studying advertising and marketing. In 2018, she landed a job at a rapidly growing e-commerce company, rapidly advanced in her career, rising from a call center worker to the head of a department in just a few years. She was considered one of the company's most promising employees. Celeste has always been the center of attention, especially among men. However, she is very picky about her partners. Meanwhile, one of her colleagues, Lua Isiko, has had his eye on her since she started working at the company. He is almost 16 years older than her and has shown no signs of career ambition, remaining in the same subordinate position for many years. Despite his reserved nature, Luis Secco was friendly and polite. He often asked Celeste out, but she consistently declined. Instead of taking the hint, Luis Secco chose to view her rejections as a challenge or a game. He believed that Celeste was playing hard to get and was determined to win her over. Despite her clear lack of interest, Lua Isiko continued to try and draw her attention through various means. Celeste finds Lua Isiko's attention annoying, but she tries to keep her cool, hoping that he will eventually lose interest or focus on someone else. However, Lua Isiko's infatuation with Celeste grows stronger over time, becoming an obsession that everyone around him notices. Celeste confided in a close friend and colleague that she would never consider a romantic relationship with Luis Secco due to several reasons. Firstly, she found him odd and unpredictable. Secondly, she was not attracted to men lacking ambition and life goals. Lastly, their significant age difference was also a factor. Despite feeling pity for Luis Secco, she knew he had no chance with her. Luis Isiko's relentless pursuit of Celeste led to a critical mistake. He neglected his work duties. As a result, his productivity plummeted, which did not go unnoticed by senior management. Luis Isiko received 3 reprimands and warnings before being dismissed in early autumn 2019. As he gathered his belongings in the office, he appeared on a verge of tears, clearly devastated by the outcome. Celeste is relieved when Luis Secco finally leaves her alone, but she also feels guilty, thinking that her actions contributed to his firing. Manno, as a department manager, thanked Luis Secco for his years of service and escorted Luis Secco out of the building. As they parted, he patted Luis Secco on the back and sincerely wished him luck. The dismissed employee, Luis Secco, came to a surprising realization. He thought Celeste was hesitant to pursue an office romance because she was his superior and it might harm her career. Now, Lua Isiko believed that there were no obstacles to their happiness and they could be together. Overcome with emotion, Lua Isiko suddenly kissed Celeste on the cheek. Shocked by his bold move, Celeste was speechless. She quickly turned around and fled back into the office without saying a word. Lua Isiko misinterpreted her reaction, thinking that Celeste had feelings for him and that he shouldn't give up on pursuing her. After being fired, Lua Isiko created a social media account and sent Celeste a friend request, which she initially accepted. However, when he began asking her to meet up and go out, she politely declined and eventually blocked him. Undeterred, Lua Isiko created a new profile and sent her another friend request the next day. Celeste tried to ignore him, but he continued to comment on her photos, complimenting her appearance and suggesting they would make a great couple. To limit Luis's Seiko contact, Celeste adjusted her profile settings to restrict messages, comments, and posts to only her friends. Despite this, a week later, she started receiving romantic messages from an unknown number, which she suspected were from Luis Secco. The messages included poems he had written, admiring her beauty and trying to persuade her to go out with him. This was particularly concerning since Lua Isiko had never had her personal phone number during their time working together, and she had only communicated with him through work channels. Celeste initially tried to address the stalker by answering one of his calls. Celeste explained to him that there was no possibility of a relationship and urged him to stop contacting her. Unfortunately, Lua Isiko was not receptive to her message and instead continued to focus on how much he enjoyed hearing her voice. Despite Celeste's attempts to block him, Lua Isiko managed to circumvent this by calling from different numbers each time. Feeling harassed, Celeste eventually changed her phone number. But to her surprise, Lua Isiko was able to obtain her new number within a week. Celeste had been trying to protect herself from Lua Isiko, a crazed fan, for about 6 months. Despite blocking Luis Seco's phone number and fake social media accounts and ignoring his messages, the harassment continued. The messages escalated from romantic to bold and threatening, followed by demands to meet Celeste. Celeste had no idea that Luis Seco had begun following her from work to her home, knowing her address. At first, she caught glimpses of Lua Isiko near her home, but Celeste assumed it was because she was too nervous. However, when she realized that Lua Isiko was actually following her, she knew she needed help. Celeste decided to seek police protection, hoping to obtain a restraining order that would prohibit the stalker from approaching her or her home. The police officers were unresponsive to Celeste's concerns, seeming to mock her request for help. They claimed that Lua Isiko had not done anything illegal, as writing explicit poems or fantasies in text messages is not against the law. Without evidence of Lua Isiko following or lurking near her home, Celeste was told to leave the police station. Celeste continued to be harassed by Lua Isiko on a regular basis. During the day, she would see his car parked across the street from her office, and at night would drive past her house several times. This constant presence made her feel uneasy. In August 2020, Celeste returned to the police station, this time providing photo and video evidence on her phone that showed Luis Seco was indeed stalking her. A different officer took her statement and was more serious about the situation, expressing surprise at his colleague's previous indifference. He advised Celeste to go to court immediately, where a restraining order was issued against Luis Seco, prohibiting him from contacting or approaching her in any way. Luis Seco's sudden disappearance brought Celeste a sense of relief and freedom. However, that feeling did not last long. Less than a month later, she began receiving text messages from unknown numbers. The messages were from Luis Seco, who initially begged her to retract his statement and dropped the restraining order, arguing that it was interfering with their romantic relationship. Over time, his tone shifted from pleading to demanding. Celeste immediately reported the messages to the police, as Luis Seco's actions were a clear violation of the restraining order. As a result, he was fined and warned that further violations would lead to severe consequences, including the possibility of jail time, if he continued to harass her. After this incident, Lua Isiko remained silent for almost 2 months, leading Celeste to believe that he had finally left her alone. Celeste met Chris Reedsdale in September 2020, and they quickly discovered they shared many common interests, life views and goals, which led to a romantic relationship. She confides in Chris about her harassment by Lua Isiko, who has been silent for over a month but still worries her. Chris made a conscious effort to make Celeste feel safe and supported, showering her with care and attention. A month later, in early November, Celeste decided it was time to introduce Chris to her family over dinner. Her family welcomed Chris warmly. The next few weeks passed peacefully, and Lua Isiko made no further attempts to contact Celeste. She was happy, spending all her free time with Chris, and it seemed that she had finally forgotten about worrying about Luis Seco. On November 15, 2020, they went on a date to a cafe where they sat together, enjoying each other's company. Celeste offered to take a selfie to capture the moment. Celeste loved the photo so much that she decided to use it as her profile picture on social media. By doing so, she also wanted to share the news of her new relationship and make it clear that things were getting serious. Chris also posted the photo on his page, along with a heartfelt caption expressing his love for Celeste. Sadly, this date turned out to be their last. After dropping Celeste off at home, Chris said goodbye, planning to see her again the next day. Celeste spent about an hour in the kitchen with her mother Eggy, before going to bed early to get ready for work the next morning. On November 16, 2020, Eggy was suddenly awakened around 4 a.m. by the sound of breaking glass. At first, she thought the noise was coming from outside, but then she heard more suspicious sounds, including banging, screams, and commotion, which seemed to be coming from within her house. Eggy quickly got out of bed, put on her robe, and rushed to her daughter Celeste's room. As she opened the door, she saw someone jumping away from Celeste's bed and escaping through a broken window. When Eggy turned on the light, she was shocked to see her daughter lying in a pool of blood, covered in cuts and small shards of glass. Celeste was struggling to breathe, her eyes wide open and looking up. Eggy immediately called an ambulance and tried to stem the bleeding from her daughter's deep wounds while she waited for help to arrive. Tragically, despite their best efforts, Celeste passed away before police and paramedics arrived. The medical examiners found over 20 stab wounds on the victim's body, with the fatal blow being a wound to her heart. After investigating the scene and comparing it to Eggy's testimony, the police concluded that the attacker broke into the Celeste's room through the window and carried out the attack in under 3 minutes before the Celeste's mother entered the room. The attacker used a large butcher's knife, striking randomly, and the Celeste tried to defend herself, as evidenced by the numerous cuts on her arms. When asked if the Celeste had any enemies, Eggy mentioned Luis Secco, who had been harassing the victim with calls and threatening messages for over a year. This information was confirmed by other family members, friends, and colleagues. The suspect left behind a large number of bloody fingerprints at the scene, as well as DNA on a fence he jumped over while fleeing, which was likely due to an injury to his hand. As a result, it was crucial to detain and interrogate Luis Secco immediately, as he was the prime suspect in the case, and to verify and compare all the evidence and witness statements. Luis Secco was immediately taken into custody, but initially claimed to be innocent, professing his love for Celeste and insisting he could never hurt her. However, forensic analysis quickly proved him wrong. His bloody fingerprints were found both in Celeste's room and on the fence surrounding her property, tying him to the crime scene. Investigation revealed a prior restraining order, which prohibited Luis Secco from approaching Celeste. Notably, the night before the crime, he bought a hammer and large knife at a local hardware store. The store's security cameras caught him purchasing the tools at checkout. It later emerged that he used these tools to carry out the violent crime, smashing through a window to enter Celeste's house and fatally stabbing her with the knife. The case against Luis Secco was overwhelming, with evidence showing he had been watching his victim for a long time and knew everything about her. The final straw was when she posted a photo of her new boyfriend on social media. After that, Luis Secco bought a knife and hammer and snuck into the victim's home at night to harm her. His actions seemed deliberate and planned. Luis Secco's personal life was marked by instability. At 39, he had never married, still lived with his parents, had few friends, and had trouble holding down a job. He also had a family history of mental health issues, with a brother serving a long prison sentence for a serious crime. Lua Isico's lawyer arguing that he needed specialized treatment rather than imprisonment. However, this claim outraged the victim's family, who feared that Lua Isico would escape punishment. The psychiatric experts ultimately concluded that while Lua Isico did have mental health issues, he was fully aware of his actions when he committed the crime. He had planned the details in advance, which meant he would have to stand trial. The murder trial is set for the fall of 2023, 3 years after Celeste's tragic death. In the years leading up to the trial, Luis Secco attempted to argue that he was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions. He spent much of that time in a psychiatric ward. During the trial, Luis Secco remained calm and detached, seemingly uninterested in the proceedings. He admitted to his guilt but claimed that his intention was not to take Celeste's life, but rather to win her love. However, the jury unanimously found him guilty on all counts. As a result, he was sentenced to 36 years in prison, with the possibility of parole only after serving 30 years. The Celeste's parents drew attention to the fact that their daughter had reported the perpetrator to the police as early as 2020, seeking protection from him. However, her complaint was not accepted due to a loophole in the existing legislation. This led to calls for a change in the law, which would later be referred to as Celeste's Law. Today's story takes us to Springfield, Colorado. Located in Colorado's southeast corner, Springfield is the home to a population of over 1,000 people. Known as a farming and ranching community, this statutory town is the most populated town situated on the county seat of Baka County. But Springfield had no clue that a mystery on its land in 1988 would take the next 34 years to get solved. On June 3, 1988, Baka County Sheriff's Office responded to a call from a Colorado farm. A local farmer reported to the Baka County Sheriff's Office that he had found what he believed to be human remains on his farm, located approximately 20 miles southeast of the town of Springfield, Baka County, Colorado. The open field was passed by truck drivers on a regular basis. When then Sheriff Willard Goff and then Coroner Robert Morrow, along with other deputies, searched the scene, they confirmed the remains as human remains. On the property, they found scattered human remains which were in a degraded skeletal condition. The remains consisted of what was most of the human skeleton. The bones were not all there, and what was there was white and bleached, with part of the spine still connected. The remains were then sent to the coroner's office for an autopsy, while the investigators scanned the area for clues. Unfortunately, they could not find any evidence that could lead them to unmask the victim's identity. People from the Baka County Coroner's Office, as well as the Sheriff's Office, spent several days searching the farm with the assistance of the farm operator. They documented several items found on the property and screened the soil in the area of the search of potential evidence. However, nothing was found to be able to identify the remains or to assist in determining how or why the person had died or how they could have ended up in the farmer's field. The remains were unrecognizable, and authorities tried in vain to come up with any significant information that could lead them to unmask the identity of the individual. Forensic examination concluded the remains belonged to a female victim who was believed to be between the ages of 19 and 24. She stood between 5 feet 2 inches and 5 feet 4 inches and weighed around 130 pounds. Her hair was brown, but her eye color could not be determined due to the remains being in a degraded condition. She was wearing gray corduroy Levi jeans with the leg cuffs hemmed up to 27.5-inch inseam, a beige-colored winter coat with a white synthetic fur collar and 4-inch fur cuffs, and a 34B bra. A single quarter dating to 1986 was found in her pocket. Forensics could not confirm the ancestry of the victim. She bore traits of Hispanic or Latino people, Native American, and European people. She had extensive dental work, including 2 silver cast crowns, 1 upper and 1 lower on the left side, which indicated that she might be from Mexico or had lived along the border of Mexico. The internals of her body suggest that she might have never given birth. It was also concluded that she had died approximately 1 to 3 years before her remains were discovered, and the nature of her death was ruled as suspicious, most likely a homicide. As the victims remained unidentified, authorities at the same time were unable to track down any of her relatives to hand down her remains to her family. With the unavailability of a name, the victim was named as the Baka County Jane Doe. In 2005, Jane Doe, along with copies of case information, was buried in the Springfield Cemetery, while all the original records of her death were kept at the sheriff's and coroner's office. Despite not having any significant evidence about the death of the Baka County Jane Doe, authorities did not give up in their attempts to solve the case. Over the years, multiple attempts were made to identify her. Dental impressions were made and dental records of the victim were submitted to the National Crime Information Center to try to obtain a match within the missing persons database. DNA samples were also taken and submitted for analysis, even though DNA was in its infancy at the time when it came to identifying victims. An anthropological study was conducted on the remains to gather information about any possible evidence on the body that could lead to its identification. Investigators also developed a facial reconstruction to get an idea of what the person might have looked like. Even the filings in her teeth were analyzed in an attempt to determine the previous location of the deceased before her death. Many possible matches, including potential dental matches, were received. But as the investigation progressed, each potential match was ruled out after comparison with the remains. Investigators also held press conferences sharing details about this case and urging the public to come forward with any knowledge they might have about the victim. But nothing was drawn from that and no one came forward. Despite the diligent efforts of the investigators, the deceased remained unidentified and the case turned cold. After remaining unsolved for over 3 decades, finally in 2021, the case got unexpected assistance and was sent in a new direction. In May 2021, the Baka County Sheriff's and Coroner's Office were contacted by an investigative intern working for the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. The person asked for permission to submit the data from the 1988 Baka County Jane Doe case and to name us, a national database of missing and unidentified persons, as well as a resource center for families to find their missing relatives, which was launched in 2007. It did not bring an immediate result, but the case got renewed attention, which also brought up other resources. Combining their resources with the Baka County Coroner's Office, Baka County Sheriff Aaron Shiplett hoped to get a breakthrough in the case of this Jane Doe. Multiple people from the Sheriff's Office and Coroner's Office spent time combining the relevant case information from both agencies' case files into the Sheriff's Office database using the original documents, which were almost 34 years old. After uploading all the information, several detectives were appointed to analyze it. On the other hand, Shiplett was also trying to contact a genetic genealogy lab, as he was hopeful that advances in technology could potentially identify Jane Doe. In July 2021, the Baka County Coroner's Office made contact with Solved by DNA, which is a Castle Rock-based genetic genealogy company, in an attempt to identify the Baka County Jane Doe. This company possesses expertise in investigative genetic genealogy and advanced DNA testing of crime scene DNA or DNA from unidentified human remains. After developing a DNA profile from the unidentified DNA, they used traditional genealogical research to predict whether a suspect or an unidentified person may fit into a family tree based on numerous DNA databases. However, an obstruction was already on its way to solving the case. Although Jane Doe had her DNA records in the original files of investigations, due to the limitations in technology available at the time, those records were not adequate to do a familial DNA study, and new DNA samples were needed to conduct the investigation. On December 13, 2021, an investigative team of the Baka County Sheriff's Office led by Shiplett exhumed the remains of Jane Doe from the Springfield Cemetery and obtained new samples of familial DNA testing and research before reburying remains. The samples were then delivered to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation in Pueblo for analysis. After a brief analysis, the CBI entered the new DNA profile into NAMUS. In August of 2022, the Baka County Sheriff's Office and Baka County Coroner's Office learned about a possible familial DNA match. Solved by DNA notified the Sheriff's Office that they had been able to locate a person through their DNA research that could be a possible family member of Jane Doe. The Baka County Sheriff's Office soon began their process of tracking down and contacting several other possible family members of the match, and was able to get them in touch with Solved by DNA. Solved by DNA then requested them to submit their own DNA for analysis, which was necessary to determine if the Baka County Jane Doe was related to them. As family members agreed, Solved by DNA initiated the process of obtaining their DNA for the necessary research. A month later, on September 26, 2022, the Baka County Sheriff's Office was notified by NAMUS regarding their discovery of a separate familial DNA match for Jane Doe. The match was linked to a person who lived in Texas and had submitted their DNA to the McAllen Police Department in Texas in 2004 in an attempt to search for missing mother, Nora Alia Castillo. Nora's daughter, Josie Castillo, was the one who submitted her DNA to the McAllen Police Department in the process of locating her missing mother. The missing person report of Nora Castillo was filed in 1996, even though she had been missing since 1986 or 1987. According to the report of the McAllen Police Department, the last contact with Nora Castillo was a collect call from somewhere in Colorado shortly before her disappearance. After further DNA testing and analysis, the identity of Baka County Jane Doe was finally confirmed as Nora Castillo. Josie Castillo could not spend much time with her mom while growing up since she lived with her dad. Despite that, she remembered her being an outgoing person who loved to laugh and smile. But Josie also remembered how social services got involved when she was 6 and her sister Crystal was 3. At a time when Nora was going through some issues, Nora attempted to get them while they lived in New Mexico with their dad. but getting into some trouble led her to the jail in Hobbs, New Mexico. From there, it said that she went to a mental institution, and that was the last time anyone ever saw from her. 4 years after their mother's mysterious disappearance, the daughters wondered about Nora's whereabouts and how she could be found. The Baka County Sheriff's Office stated, almost 36 years, the family of Nora Alia Castillo finally knows where she is. Along with Josie, her sister Crystal was also notified about their mother's final fate. Although their hope of ever getting their mother alive was shattered, they were happy to have a sense of closure after all these years of waiting. All this came out of absolutely nowhere, and it's a lot, Crystal stated. Despite seeking answers regarding what led to her mother's untimely demise, Josie said she can now go to sleep at night knowing where her mom is thanks to genetic genealogy. My heart is healing. There's a healing process now, Josie stated. Nora's family has since been able to visit Nora's last resting place and even the location where she was discovered. However, authorities are still unaware of what happened to lead to Castillo's death. The details of how Nora Alia Castillo died or why she was in Colorado are still under investigation. For now, this case is still being investigated as a potential homicide. Baka County Deputy Coroner Everett Brissendine said, "We're hoping we would get some kind of tip that would lead us to knowing more about why and how she died." After 3 decades of remaining as a Jane Doe, Nora finally reunited with her family, but even in death, she is still deprived of justice. If anyone out there knows anything, do not hesitate to come forward, as your information could be invaluable to unmask the murderer. Do you think Nora's daughters would have ever known the fate of their mother without the miracle of genetic genealogy? Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.